The thunder cracked overhead as Willa Owens hurried to collect the last of her firewood, cursing the dark clouds that had rolled in without warning. Her father's warnings about the coming storm had fallen on deaf ears this morning, her stubborn determination to finish her chores before nightfall overriding common sense. Now, as the first fat raindrops splattered against her face, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. Independence, Missouri, 1857. The frontier town had been Willa's home for all 22 years of her life, but the surrounding forest still held its dangers, especially for a woman alone. As the rain began to pour in earnest, she sought shelter beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. The wind howled, bending the trees around her at precarious angles. "Just wait it out," she murmured to herself, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It will pass." But the storm only intensified. Lightning flashed, illuminating the darkened woods in brief, terrifying glimpses. One bolt struck with a deafening crack not 50 yards from where she stood, and the massive pine it hit began to groan. Willa's eyes widened in horror as the tree slowly tipped in her direction. She tried to run, but her foot caught on an exposed root. As she fell, the massive pine crashed down, pinning her legs beneath its enormous weight. Pain shot through her body and she screamed, the sound lost in the howling wind. "Help!" she cried out, though she knew no one could hear her. The rain pelted her face, mixing with the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, someone help me." Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes' time lost meaning as Willa drifted between consciousness and oblivion. The storm eventually subsided, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional drip of rainwater from the leaves above. Her legs had gone numb, but she knew that was a bad sign rather than a relief. Then she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Hope surged through her and she used what strength remained to call out, "Over here, please, I'm trapped." The hoofbeats stopped, followed by the sound of boots hitting damp earth. A tall figure emerged from between the trees, silhouetted against the clearing sky. "Madam, where are you?" The voice was deep, tinged with concern. "Here, under the tree," Willa called back, her voice hoarse from screaming. The man approached, and as he knelt beside her, Willa could finally see his face. Weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of the Missouri sky on a clear day, he wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim, leather vest, and a hat that had seen better days. "My God," he breathed, taking in her predicament. "How long have you been here?" "Since the storm began," she managed through chattering teeth. "I can't feel my legs anymore." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair with just a touch of curl to it. "My name's Preston Miller, madam. I'm going to get you out of here." "Willa." "Willa Owens," she replied, watching as he assessed the fallen tree. Preston circled the massive trunk, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is going to be difficult, Miss Owens. I can't move it with my horse without risking crushing you further." "What are you going to do?" Fear crept back into her voice. He removed his leather vest and rolled up his sleeves, revealing powerful forearms corded with muscle. "Only one way to find out what I'm capable of, when a lady needs help." Preston positioned himself at the section of trunk directly above her legs. He crouched low, worked his hands underneath the rough bark, and took a deep breath. "When I lift, you need to pull yourself free. Can you do that?" Willa nodded, though she wasn't certain she had the strength. With a grunt that seemed torn from the depths of his soul, Preston began to lift. The veins in his neck and arms stood out like rivers on a map as he strained against the enormous weight. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, the tree began to rise inch by agonizing inch. "Now, Miss Owens," he gasped through clenched teeth. Summoning every ounce of her remaining strength, Willa dragged herself backward. The pain that shot through her legs as circulation returned nearly caused her to black out, but she kept moving until she was clear of the trunk. With a tremendous crash, Preston dropped the tree, falling to his knees beside it, his breathing ragged. "You did it," Willa whispered in awe. "You actually lifted it." He gave her a tired smile. Couldn't leave a lady in distress. As he recovered his breath, Preston examined her legs. They were badly bruised and scraped, but by some miracle, nothing appeared broken. "Can you stand?" he asked, offering his hand. Willa tried but cried out as her legs buckled beneath her. Without hesitation, Preston scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "My horse is just beyond that ridge," he said. "I'll take you into town to the doctor." "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly aware of how close his face was to hers, of the strong arms cradling her against a broad chest. "You saved my life." Something flickered in those blue eyes, something warm that made her heart skip a beat despite her pain and exhaustion. "Just doing what any man would, Miss Owens." But as he carried her through the forest, Willa knew there was nothing ordinary about Preston Miller or what he had done today. Dr. Samuel Harrison's office in Independence was small but meticulously kept. The elderly physician had been treating the townspeople for over 30 years, and his experienced hands worked gently as he examined Willa's injuries. "You're a fortunate young woman," he pronounced, straightening up. "No broken bones, though those bruises will take weeks to fade. Rest and keep your legs elevated for a few days. I'll give you a salve for the pain." Preston, who had refused to leave despite Willa's insistence that he'd done enough, stood by the window, his hat in his hands. "I should get word to my father," Willa said, attempting to sit up. "He'll be worried sick." "George Owens, right?" Preston asked. "The carpenter. I know where his shop is. I can let him know you're safe." Willa's surprise must have shown on her face, for Preston added, "Small town. I've only been here 3 months, but I make it my business to know the people. Mr. Miller arrived from Texas in the spring," Dr. Harrison explained as he mixed the salve. "Bought the old Jenkins place outside town." "I'm trying my hand at raising horses," Preston said with a modest shrug. "Nothing fancy yet, but I've got good stock." After Preston left to inform her father, Dr. Harrison helped Willa to the small cot in his back room. "That young man carried you all the way from the forest?" "Yes," Willa replied, still somewhat in disbelief herself. "And he lifted a tree off me." "A whole tree, Dr. Harrison. I've never seen anything like it." The doctor smiled knowingly. "Fear and necessity can give a man strength he never knew he had, especially when a pretty young woman is in danger." Willa felt her cheeks flush. "I'm sure he would have done the same for anyone." "Perhaps," the doctor conceded, "but I don't believe he would have stayed, waiting to ensure just anyone was all right." Before Willa could respond, the door burst open and George Owens rushed in, his face pale with worry. Behind him stood Preston, looking apologetic for the carpenter's haste. "Willa," her father cried, hurrying to her side. "My God, child, when you didn't come home, I'm all right, Pa," she assured him, reaching for his hand. "Mr. Miller found me. He saved my life." George turned to Preston, grasping his hand in both of his. "I don't know how to thank you, son." "No thanks necessary, sir," Preston replied, his gaze shifting to Willa. "I'm just glad I was riding that trail today." "We need to get her home," George said, looking back at his daughter. "Can she be moved, doctor?" Dr. Harrison nodded. "As long as she stays off her feet for a few days." "I'll check on her tomorrow." "My wagon's outside," George said. "I can take her." "If you don't mind, Mr. Owens," Preston interjected, "I'd be happy to carry Miss Willa to the wagon. Might be easier on her than being helped to walk." George nodded gratefully, and before Willa could protest, Preston had swept her into his arms again. She couldn't help but notice how naturally she seemed to fit there, how secure she felt despite her injuries. As they reached the wagon, Preston set her down gently on the bench seat. Their eyes met for a moment and Willa felt something flutter in her chest. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." A smile touched his lips. "I'm just glad I did." He hesitated, then added, "If it wouldn't be too forward, Miss Owens, I'd like to call on you when you're feeling better. To check on your recovery, of course." "I'd like that," she replied, surprised by how much she meant it. As the wagon pulled away, Willa found herself looking back at Preston's tall figure standing in the street, watching them go. For all the pain and fear of the day, she couldn't help but feel that something important had just begun. 3 days later, Willa was sitting on the porch of her father's modest home when she spotted a rider approaching. Her heart quickened as she recognized Preston Miller's broad-shouldered silhouette. He rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, and both man and horse cut an impressive figure against the late afternoon sky. "Miss Owens," he called, tipping his hat as he drew near. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Miller," she replied, smoothing her skirts self-consciously. "Please join me." He dismounted with fluid grace, tethering his horse to the hitching post before climbing the porch steps. In one hand he carried a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something," he said, offering the package. "Nothing fancy, just a remedy my mother used to make for bruises and aches." Willa accepted the gift with a smile. "That's very kind of you. How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Much better," she assured him. "Still sore, but I managed to walk around the house today without too much trouble." "I'm glad to hear it." His eyes, blue as the summer sky, held genuine relief. "I've been worried about you." The admission sent a pleasant warmth through her. "You've been on my mind as well, Mr. Miller." "I still can't believe what you did." A flush crept up his neck. "Please call me Preston, and I only did what needed doing." "Preston," she repeated, liking the way his name felt on her tongue. "Then you must call me Willa." They fell into easy conversation as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. Preston told her about his ranch in Texas, how he'd sold it after his parents passed to start fresh in Missouri. Willa spoke of her mother's death when she was 15, how she'd taken over the household for her father and younger brother, who was now off apprenticing in St. Louis. "It's not always easy being a woman alone in a town like this," she confided. "Everyone has expectations about what I should be doing with my life." "And what do you want to be doing?" he asked, genuinely curious. The question caught her off guard. Few people had ever asked what she wanted. "I love to read," she admitted. "And write. I keep journals, silly stories, mostly. Someday I'd like to see more of the world than just independence." Instead of dismissing her dreams as fanciful as others had, Preston nodded thoughtfully. "The world's a big place, full of wonders. I've seen some of it, but not nearly enough." Before she could respond, the front door opened and her father appeared. "Thought I heard voices." "Evening, Miller." "Mr. Owens," Preston acknowledged, standing respectfully. "I hope you don't mind my calling to check on your daughter." "Not at all," George replied, though his eyes held a protective glint. "You planning to stay for supper? Willa makes a fine stew." "Pa," Willa protested, embarrassed by the transparent matchmaking, but Preston smiled. "I'd be honored if it's no trouble." Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Preston regaling them with tales of his travels. Willa found herself captivated not just by his stories, but by the man himself, his expressive hands, the rich timbre of his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. As the evening drew to a close, Preston helped Willa to the porch while her father cleared the dishes, insisting she needed fresh air before bed. "I should be going," Preston said, though he made no move to leave. "But I'd like to call on you again, if that would be agreeable." "Very agreeable," Willa replied softly. In the silver moonlight, his eyes seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. He took her hand, his touch sending a thrill up her arm. "Until then, Willa Owens," he said, bringing her fingers to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and heart-stoppingly intimate. As she watched him ride away, Willa realized that her life had changed the moment Preston Miller lifted that tree. The question was, where would this new path lead? Over the next 2 weeks? Preston became a regular visitor at the Owens household. As Willa's strength returned, he began to take her on short walks through town, always solicitous of her comfort, offering his arm for support. Independence was abuzz with the story of her rescue, and more than one curious glance was cast their way as they strolled down Main Street. Willa pretended not to notice the whispers that followed them, though she couldn't help but feel a certain pride in being seen with a man like Preston. "People are talking," she commented one afternoon as they sat on a bench outside the general store, enjoying ice cream that Preston had insisted on buying. "Let them," he replied with a shrug. "Small towns run on gossip, gives folks something to do besides worry about crops and weather." Willa laughed, then grew serious. "They're saying you're courting me." Preston's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Would that be so terrible? Her heart skipped. "No," she admitted, "not terrible at all." A slow smile spread across his face, lighting his eyes in a way that made her breath catch. "Good, because I believe I am." From that day forward, their relationship took on a new dimension. Preston would arrive each evening after supper, sometimes bringing small gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, wildflowers gathered from the fields near his property. On Sundays after church, he would join the Owens family for dinner, charming her father with discussions of carpentry and building. George Owens was crafting furniture for Preston's house, and the two men had developed a genuine respect for one another. As July turned to August, Preston invited Willa to visit his ranch. "Properly chaperoned, of course," he added hastily when her father raised an eyebrow. "I thought perhaps you and your father might come for Sunday dinner this time. I'm not much of a cook, but Mrs. Leary from town comes out to help with the housekeeping, and she's promised to prepare something special." The ranch was a revelation. 5 miles outside of Independence, the property sprawled across rolling hills, with a modest but well-built house overlooking a valley where horses grazed in lush pastures. A barn and several outbuildings completed the picture of a growing operation. "It's beautiful," Willa breathed as Preston helped her down from her father's wagon. "It's a work in progress," he replied, but his pride was evident in his voice. "Come, I'll show you around." While her father examined the barn with appreciative eyes, Preston led Willa through the house. Simple but comfortable, it had clearly been designed with an eye toward the future. "This would make a fine room for children someday," he commented as they passed a space currently used for storage. When he realized what he'd said, he flushed. "I mean, for whoever might live here eventually." Willa felt her own cheeks grow warm, but the thought didn't displease her. As they continued the tour, she could almost see herself here tending a garden, reading by the large front window, welcoming Preston home after a day with the horses. The thought startled her with its clarity and yearning. Dinner was served on the wide front porch, with a view of the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mrs. Leary had outdone herself with roast chicken, fresh vegetables from her own garden, and an apple pie that even Willa had to admit rivaled her own. As they ate, Preston spoke of his plans for the ranch, the breeds he hoped to raise, the expansion he envisioned. "It's a big undertaking for one man," George observed, helping himself to more potatoes. "Yes, sir, it is," Preston agreed, "but I've never been afraid of hard work." Nor extraordinary feats of strength, apparently, George added with a knowing smile. Willa tells me that tree you lifted was a good 20 inches in diameter. Preston looked embarrassed. I don't rightly know what came over me, just knew I had to get it off her. Fear and necessity, Willa murmured, recalling Dr. Harrison's words. Preston's eyes met hers across the table, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that whatever had begun that day in the forest was growing into something neither of them had anticipated but both increasingly desired. As the weeks passed, Preston and Willa's courtship deepened. They exchanged confidences, shared dreams, and gradually pieced together the tapestry of each other's lives. Preston spoke of his childhood in Texas, of learning horsemanship from his father and compassion from his mother. Willa told him of her aspirations to write, showing him some of her stories with nervous anticipation that turned to delight when he pronounced them captivating. By early September, as golden leaves began to drift from the trees, it was widely accepted in Independence that Preston Miller and Willa Owens would soon announce their engagement. Even Willa's father had taken to making pointed comments about the quality of the wood he was saving for a hope chest. Then came the fire. It began in the mercantile, they said later. A lantern knocked over by a careless clerk. By the time the alarm was raised, flames had already engulfed the dry goods section and were licking hungrily at the adjacent buildings. Willa was at home, preparing dinner, when she heard the church bell ringing urgently the signal for danger. Stepping onto the porch, she saw the plume of black smoke rising from the direction of Main Street. Without hesitation, she grabbed a shawl and ran toward town. Her father's workshop was near the mercantile, and fear clutched at her heart as she thought of him trapped inside. The scene that greeted her was one of chaos. Men formed bucket brigades from the town pump, while women ushered children and elderly residents to safety. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke and shouts. "Pa," she called, scanning the crowd desperately. "Has anyone seen my father?" A neighbor pointed toward the workshop. "He was helping evacuate the boarding house last I saw." Relief surged through Willa, only to be replaced by fresh terror as she realized Preston's horse was tied outside the burning mercantile. He was in there. Before she could think better of it, Willa pushed through the crowd toward the building. A wall of heat struck her as she approached, and someone grabbed her arm. "Miss Owens, you can't go near there." It was Sheriff Davies, his face streaked with soot. "The whole place could collapse any minute." "Preston's in there," she cried, struggling against his grip. As if summoned by her fear, a figure emerged from the smoke-filled doorway of the mercantile. Preston, carrying an unconscious woman in his arms. His shirt was singed, his face blackened, but his eyes found Willa's immediately across the chaotic street. He handed the woman to waiting hands, then turned back toward the building. Willa's heart stopped. "No," she screamed, breaking free from the sheriff's grasp. "Preston, no," but he had already disappeared back into the inferno. Seconds stretched into an eternity as Willa stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the doorway. The building groaned ominously, timbers shifting under the assault of the flames. Just as she thought her heart would shatter from fear, Preston reappeared, this time supporting an elderly man. They had barely cleared the doorway when, with a deafening crash, the mercantile's roof caved in, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris into the night sky. Preston helped the old man to safety, then staggered slightly. Willa ran to him, heedless of the danger, and caught him as his knees buckled. "You fool," she sobbed, cradling his head. "You wonderful, reckless fool." His eyes, reddened from smoke, looked up at her with a mixture of pain and tenderness. "Couldn't leave them in there," he rasped. "Doctor." Harrison appeared beside them, his medical bag in hand. "Let's get him to my office," he he ordered. "He's inhaled too much smoke." The next hours were a blur of fear and prayer as Willa sat beside Preston's bed in the doctor's back room. His breathing was labored, and occasional coughing fits racked his powerful frame. Dr. Harrison had treated the burns on his hands and arms, pronouncing them painful but not life-threatening. It was the smoke inhalation that concerned him most. "Talk to him," the doctor advised before leaving to check on other victims. "Keep him awake if you can." Willa took Preston's bandaged hand gently in hers. "You scared me to death," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open. "Sorry," he managed before another cough seized him. "Why did you go back in?" She couldn't keep the anguish from her voice. Preston's chest heaved as he struggled to speak. "Old man Jenkins, heard him calling, couldn't leave him." Tears spilled down Willa's cheeks. "You could have died." His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "Worth the risk." "Not to me," she said fiercely. "Nothing is worth losing you." The admission hung in the air between them, naked and profound. Preston's eyes, despite his pain, softened with an emotion that made Willa's heart race. "Willa Owens," he whispered hoarsely, "I believe I'm in love with you." The words, spoken without preamble or pretense, struck her like a physical force. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of disaster, with the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes, Willa recognized the truth that had been growing in her heart since the day Preston lifted that tree. "I love you too," she replied, her voice breaking. "So you had better recover quickly, Preston Miller, because I intend to hold you to those words." A smile touched his lips before another coughing fit seized him. When it passed, exhaustion was evident in every line of his face. "Rest now," Willa urged, stroking his hair back from his forehead. "I'll be here when you wake." And she was, through the night and into the next day, leaving his side only when her father insisted she eat something. George Owens, whose workshop had been spared the worst of the fire, brought news of the town's recovery efforts and sat with Preston while Willa reluctantly took brief breaks. By the second day, Preston's breathing had eased, and the doctor pronounced him on the mend. "You'll need to take it easy for a while," Dr. Harrison warned. "Those lungs need time to heal." "I'll make sure he does," Willa promised, her tone brooking no argument. When Preston was strong enough to travel, she insisted on accompanying him back to his ranch. "Someone has to look after you," she declared when he protested weakly that it wasn't proper. "Your father agrees with me," she interrupted. "Mrs. Leary will stay as chaperone, and Pa will visit daily." In truth, George Owens had been surprisingly supportive of the arrangement. "That young man saved half the town," he'd said gruffly. "Least we can do is make sure he recovers properly." So it was that Willa found herself installed at the Miller Ranch, nursing Preston back to health. Mrs. Leary, a widow of unimpeachable reputation, maintained a watchful eye, but allowed Willa to take the lead in Preston's care. As September gave way to October, Preston's strength gradually returned. They spent long hours on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, talking about everything and nothing. Willa read to him from her favorite books and shared more of her own stories. Preston listened with rapt attention, offering encouragement and genuine appreciation for her talent. "You should submit these to a newspaper or magazine," he suggested one evening as she finished reading a tale she'd written about a pioneer woman's journey west. "People would pay to read stories like that." Willa blushed with pleasure. "Perhaps someday. Right now, I'm content to have an audience of one." His eyes held hers across the twilit porch. "I'd like to be your audience for a very long time, Willa." The implication was clear and her heart quickened. "I'd like that too." As Preston's recovery progressed, he began to take short walks with Willa around the property, his arm linked with hers as much for the pleasure of her closeness as for support. They watched the horses in the pasture, planned improvements to the house, and planted bulbs in the garden that would bloom in spring, a future they both silently acknowledged they intended to share. One crisp October afternoon, as golden light bathed the hills in amber, Preston suggested they ride to his favorite spot on the property. Willa, who had been taking riding lessons from him, agreed eagerly. He helped her mount a gentle mare, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary. His touch sent a now familiar warmth through her, a sensation she had come to treasure. They rode at a leisurely pace, Preston pointing out landmarks and sharing his vision for different parts of the ranch. Finally, they crested a hill overlooking a small, secluded valley where a stream meandered through a grove of cottonwoods. "It's beautiful," Willa breathed as they dismounted. Preston spread a blanket beneath one of the trees, and they sat side by side, watching the play of light on water. "I come here to think," he said, his voice thoughtful. "When I first bought this land, I spent hours sitting right here, imagining what it could become." "And what did you see?" she asked, drawn in by the earnestness in his expression. "A home," he replied simply. "Not just a house and barn, but a place filled with life and love." He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "I never imagined who would share it with me, though, until now." Willa's heart began to race as Preston slid from the blanket to one knee before her. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "Willa Owens," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months have been the most meaningful of my life. From the moment I found you in those woods, something inside me knew you were the one I'd been waiting for, though I hadn't realized I was waiting." He opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I love you with everything I am. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Willa's vision as joy welled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Preston. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a promise of all that was to come. When they finally broke apart, breathless and beaming, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I thought I was strong the day I lifted that tree," he murmured. "But loving you takes a different kind of strength, the courage to open my heart completely, to build a life worthy of you." Willa touched his cheek gently. "We'll build it together, day by day." They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, their happiness too great to contain. Mrs. Leary took one look at their radiant faces and the ring on Willa's finger and burst into delighted tears, insisting on preparing a special dinner to celebrate. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Independence. Well-wishers stopped by with congratulations and gifts, and Willa's father embraced Preston like the son he'd never had. "Take care of my girl," he said gruffly, emotion making his voice rough. "With my life," Preston promised, and no one who heard him doubted his word. They set the wedding date for the first Saturday in December, giving them time to prepare, but not so long that they would have to endure a lengthy engagement. Willa, with help from the ladies of the town, began work on her wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Preston, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing the ranch house for his bride. He added a larger bookcase to the sitting room for Willa's growing collection, built a proper desk where she could write, and with George's help, constructed the promised hope chest, which they filled with linens and household items. As the wedding approached, however, trouble arrived in the form of Jasper Thornton, the wealthy owner of the largest cattle ranch in the county. Thornton had had his eye on Preston's land since before Miller purchased it, seeing it as a natural extension to his own holdings. He had made several offers, each rebuffed politely but firmly by Preston. Now, with Preston's horse breeding operation beginning to gain recognition, and his impending marriage to one of the town's most respected young women solidifying his position in the community, Thornton decided to take more aggressive action. It began with small incidents: a section of fence mysteriously cut, allowing several of Preston's prized horses to wander onto Thornton property, where they were found and returned for a reasonable fee. Then water access to the stream running through Preston's land was suddenly blocked by a dam constructed on Thornton's adjacent property. "He's trying to force you to sell," Willa said worriedly as they inspected the dam. "This isn't legal, is it?" "Not entirely," Preston replied, his jaw tight with anger. "But Thornton has the county judge in his pocket and half the town owes him money in some form or another." "What are you going to do?" Preston sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Try to reason with him first. If that doesn't work—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the possibility of more serious conflict. The meeting with Thornton went as poorly as expected. The older man, corpulent and florid from years of rich living, lounged behind his massive desk and smirked as Preston stated his case. "Water rights are complicated, Miller," Thornton drawled, examining his manicured nails. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'll remove the dam if you sell me your northern parcel. That's fair, isn't it?" "That parcel contains my best grazing land," Preston replied evenly. "You know that as well as I do." Thornton shrugged, his smile turning predatory. "Then I suppose you'll have to find another water source, or reconsider my offer for the entire property. My previous price still stands." Preston left the meeting seething but determined not to let Thornton win. With help from several neighbors who had their own grievances with the cattle baron, he began digging a new well on his property. It was backbreaking work, especially with his lungs still not fully recovered from the smoke damage, but Preston refused to show weakness. Willa worried constantly, watching him push himself to exhaustion day after day. "This can't go on," she told him one evening as she treated the blisters on his hands. "You're going to make yourself ill again." "What choice do I have?" he asked, frustration evident in his voice. "I won't be bullied off my land, and I won't start our marriage with a defeat." "It wouldn't be defeat to ask for help," she said softly. "You taught me that when you found me under that tree. Sometimes strength is knowing when you can't do something alone." Her words gave him pause, and the next day, Preston rode into town to speak with Sheriff Davies. Though sympathetic, the sheriff's hands were tied by legal technicalities and Thornton's influence. However, he suggested another approach. "The territorial governor is making a visit to Independence next week," Davies informed Preston. "He's not in Thornton's pocket, and he takes water rights seriously. Might be worth presenting your case directly to him." It was a slim chance, but Preston seized it. He prepared meticulously, gathering evidence of Thornton's interference and statements from neighbors who had witnessed the cattle baron's tactics. Willa helped him organize his presentation, her skill with words proving invaluable as they crafted a compelling argument. The day of the governor's arrival dawned clear and cold. Preston dressed in his best suit, the one he had purchased for the wedding, and Willa pinned a fresh flower to his lapel for luck. "No matter what happens," she told him, straightening his tie, "we'll face it together." The town hall meeting was crowded, with citizens bringing various matters before the governor. Preston waited patiently for his turn, Willa beside him offering silent support. When finally called forward, he presented his case with clarity and dignity, letting the facts speak for themselves rather than resorting to emotional appeals. The governor, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for fairness, listened attentively, asking pointed questions that suggested he understood the underlying issues. Thornton, present in the front row, grew increasingly agitated as the discussion proceeded, his face reddening alarmingly. Finally, unable to contain himself, he burst out, "This is ridiculous. Miller is a newcomer trying to disrupt established practices that have worked for years." The governor fixed Thornton with a cool stare. "Mr. Thornton, from what I understand, the established practice was free access to a natural waterway. It seems you're the one disrupting things." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Thornton's face darkened further. "I've heard enough," the governor continued. "The dam is to be removed within 3 days, at Mr. Thornton's expense. Additionally, I'll be instructing the territorial surveyor to review all water rights in this county. It seems some clarification is needed." Preston's relief was palpable as they left the town hall. Thornton brushed past them, pausing only long enough to hiss, "This isn't over, Miller," before storming off to his waiting carriage. "You think he means that?" Willa asked worriedly as they walked to where Preston had tethered his horse. "Probably," Preston admitted. "But he'll be more careful now that the governor has his eye on him." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry. We've won this round, and that's what matters." True to the governor's order, the dam was removed, and water flowed freely once more across Preston's land. Thornton retreated to his ranch, sullen but compliant, at least for the time being. With that crisis averted, Preston and Willa could turn their attention back to the approaching wedding. November slipped away in a flurry of preparations, and before they knew it, December had arrived, bringing with it a light dusting of snow that transformed Independence into a winter wonderland. The night before the wedding, a celebration was held at the town hall, a tradition for well-liked couples. Nearly everyone in Independence attended, bringing food, drink, and good wishes. Music and laughter filled the decorated space as neighbors and friends gathered to honor the couple. During a lull in the festivities, Preston drew Willa outside, where the crisp night air was a relief after the heat of the crowded hall. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package from his pocket. "A wedding gift, though I couldn't wait until tomorrow." Willa unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with her initials, her future initials, W.M. "For your stories," Preston explained. "The first of many, I hope." Tears pricked at her eyes as she ran her fingers over the fine leather. "It's perfect." "Thank you." "There's more," he said, his expression turning serious. "I've been corresponding with an editor at a magazine in St. Louis, sent him some of your stories, with your brother's help to deliver them. He wants to publish The Pioneer Woman. Says it's exactly the kind of authentic frontier tale their readers are interested in." Willa stared at him in disbelief. "You did what? How? When?" Preston laughed at her astonishment. "I copied the story from your notebook while you were helping Mrs. Leary with preserves last month. Your brother delivered it on his way back to his apprenticeship. The editor's letter arrived yesterday." He produced an envelope from his inside pocket. With trembling hands, Willa opened it and read the enthusiastic response, including an offer of payment for her work and encouragement to submit more stories. "You did this for me," she whispered, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "I believe in you, Willa," Preston said simply. "Your stories deserve to be read by more than just me, wonderful as your audience of one might be." Impulsively, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, propriety forgotten in the joy of the moment. Preston responded with equal fervor, holding her close as snowflakes began to drift softly around them. "Just one more day," he murmured when they finally broke apart. "One more day, and you'll be Mrs. Preston Miller." "I can hardly wait," she replied, her eyes shining with love and anticipation. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. the fresh snow glistening in the winter sunshine. The small church in Independence was decorated with evergreen boughs and white ribbons, and candles glowed from every windowsill. In a room at the back of the church, Willa stood before a mirror, hardly recognizing the radiant woman who looked back at her. Her wedding dress, the product of countless hours of loving labor, flowed gracefully around her. Her hair was arranged in soft curls beneath a veil, adorned with tiny pearl beads, and her mother's cameo hung at her throat. A knock at the door heralded her father's arrival. George Owens stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of his daughter. "You look just like your mother," he said hoarsely, emotion making his voice rough. "She would be so proud today." Willa embraced him, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "I wish she could be here." "She is, in a way," George replied, patting her hand. "In you, in this day." He cleared his throat. "Ready? Your groom is waiting, and I don't think the poor fellow can stand much more anticipation." With a deep breath, Willa took her father's arm. "I'm ready." The church fell silent as the doors opened and Willa appeared on her father's arm. At the altar, Preston turned, and the look of wonder and love that transformed his face at the sight of her was something Willa knew she would remember all her days. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and sacred words. They had written their own vows, promises that spoke of partnership, respect, and enduring love. When Preston slipped the gold band onto Willa's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear and certain as he pledged himself to her. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, beaming at the couple. "You may kiss your bride." Preston's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all they would share in the years to come. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause as they turned to face their friends and family as Mr. and Mrs. Preston Miller. The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous and lively. Everyone in Independence seemed determined to give the newlyweds a send-off worthy of the love they had found in such extraordinary circumstances. There was dancing and feasting, toasts and laughter that continued well into the evening. As night fell, Preston led his bride to the waiting carriage that would take them to the ranch, their home. Mrs. Leary had discreetly departed that morning, leaving the house prepared for the newlyweds' arrival, with a fire laid in the bedroom hearth and a cold supper waiting in the kitchen. The ride home was quiet, both of them wrapped in the wonder of what had transpired and the anticipation of what was to come. Preston's arm around Willa's shoulders kept her warm against the December chill, and she leaned into him, savoring the closeness. When they arrived at the ranch, Preston surprised her by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Is this necessary?" she laughed, though she made no move to protest. "Absolutely," he replied with mock seriousness. "I have a reputation to maintain as the man who can lift impossible burdens." Inside, the house glowed with warmth and welcome. A fire crackled in the sitting room hearth, and candles had been lit throughout the main floor, casting a golden light over what was now their shared home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Miller," Preston said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "Home," Willa repeated, looking around the room that already held so many memories and would hold countless more. "I like the sound of that." Later, after they had shared the simple meal Mrs. Leary had prepared, they sat before the fire, Willa nestled against Preston's side, his arm holding her close. "You remember what you thought when you first saw me, trapped under that tree?" she asked, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the back of his hand. Preston was quiet for a moment, considering. "I remember thinking that you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. In such pain, so afraid but still fighting. And beautiful God, so beautiful, even covered in mud and tears." Willa turned her face up to his, touched by his honesty. "I thought you were an angel at first, then a giant. I'd never seen anyone so strong," he smiled, a hint of self-deprecation in his expression. "Not an angel, just a man in the right place at the right time." "My angel nonetheless," she insisted, reaching up to touch his cheek. "My miracle." His eyes darkened as he looked down at her, love and desire mingling in their blue depths. "Willa," he breathed, her name a caress on his lips. Words gave way to touches, tentative at first, then growing in confidence as they discovered each other. Preston's hands, so powerful yet gentle, traced the contours of her body through the fabric of her dress, while Willa's fingers tangled in his hair, drawing him closer. When he finally swept her into his arms again to carry her upstairs to their bedroom, Willa felt no fear, only a deep certainty that this was right, that they belonged together in every way. The months that followed were filled with the joys and challenges of building a life together. Winter settled over the Missouri countryside, bringing snow and ice that kept them close to home. They spent evenings reading aloud by the fire, Preston working on plans for spring breeding, Willa writing stories that increasingly found their way into publications across the country. Their first major test as a married couple came in January, when a blizzard swept through the region, trapping them in the house for 3 days. The temperature dropped to dangerous lows, and Preston worked tirelessly to keep the livestock sheltered and fed, making perilous trips to the barn through whiteout conditions. Willa worried constantly, standing at the window watching for his return each time he ventured out. When he finally stumbled in, half frozen from his last check on the animals, she helped him out of his ice-encrusted clothes and into a hot bath she'd prepared, thanking God for his safe return. "The horses?" she asked as she rubbed feeling back into his frigid hands. "Safe," he assured her through chattering teeth. "Lost 2 chickens, but everything else is holding on." By spring, life on the Miller Ranch had settled into a pleasant routine. Preston's horse breeding business was thriving, with buyers coming from as far as St. Louis to purchase his stock. Willa's writing had begun to bring in a steady, if modest, income, and she had started work on a novel based loosely on their own love story. In April, as wildflowers carpeted the hills and new foals wobbled on spindly legs in the pastures, Willa confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting their first child. She shared the news with Preston one evening as they walked along the stream that had been the source of so much conflict the previous year. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a tenderness that made her heart overflow. "A baby," he whispered, placing a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Due in November, Dr. Harrison thinks," Willa said, covering his hand with her own. Preston knelt suddenly before her, pressing a gentle kiss to her midsection. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "Your mama and papa can't wait to meet you." Looking up at Willa, his eyes shining with unshed tears, he added, "Thank you for this gift, for everything." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. Preston was attentiveness itself, insisting on taking over many of Willa's household duties as her condition advanced. He built a cradle of polished cherry wood, carving delicate patterns of leaves and flowers along its sides, and converted the room he had once mentioned as perfect for children into a nursery. Willa's father was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, visiting often to help with projects around the ranch and to bring gifts for the coming baby. The women of Independence, led by Mrs. Leary, organized a quilting bee to create a special blanket, each square contributed by a different family with wishes for the child's future. Even Jasper Thornton seemed to have made peace with the situation. After the governor's intervention, He had become less antagonistic, and by summer, a cautious civility had developed between the two men. When news of the pregnancy reached him, Thornton surprised everyone by sending a fine rocking horse, handcrafted by one of his ranch hands known for his woodworking skills. "People can change," Preston remarked as they admired the gift. "Or at least, they can learn to live and let live." As autumn painted the countryside in gold and crimson, Willa grew increasingly uncomfortable, her petite frame struggling to accommodate the active child within. Preston would often find her in the nursery, rocking in the chair he had placed by the window, her hands cradling her swollen belly as she sang softly to their unborn baby. "Not long now," he would say, massaging her tired shoulders. "Just a few more weeks." But babies, as they would learn, have their own timetables. On a stormy evening in late October, a full 2 weeks before her expected due date, Willa felt the first sharp pain that signaled the beginning of labor. Preston, who had been checking on a mare about to foal, returned to find her leaning against the kitchen table, face pale with pain. "The baby's coming," she gasped as another contraction seized her. "It's too early." Without hesitation, Preston lifted her into his arms and carried her upstairs to their bedroom. "I'll fetch Dr. Harrison," he said, tucking blankets around her. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Willa nodded, though fear was evident in her eyes. "Hurry." The ride into town was a nightmare, with rain lashing down and the trail treacherous with mud. Preston pushed his horse to its limits, praying that the doctor would be available and that Willa would hold on until they returned. Dr. Harrison, thankfully, was at home and quickly gathered his supplies. The return journey seemed to take an eternity, though in reality it was less than an hour before they were rushing into the house, where Mrs. Leary, summoned by a quick stop at her cottage, was already attending to Willa. What followed were the longest hours of Preston's life. Banished from the bedroom as was customary, he paced the downstairs like a caged animal, flinching at each cry that filtered down from above. Twice he started up the stairs, unable to bear the thought of Willa suffering alone, only to be firmly turned back by Mrs. Leary. "This is women's work," she insisted. "You'll only be in the way." So he waited, prayed, and prepared for whatever outcome the night might bring. He built up the fire, boiled water as instructed, and tried not to think of all the women who had died bringing children into the world, including his own mother. Just before dawn, when Preston had begun to fear the worst, a new sound cut through the storm's diminishing fury, the lusty cry of a newborn. He was on his feet instantly, all exhaustion forgotten as he bounded up the stairs, pausing only briefly outside the bedroom door before knocking. "Come in, Mr. Miller," Dr. Harrison called, his voice weary but satisfied. "There's someone here who wants to meet you." Preston entered to find Willa propped against pillows, pale and exhausted but with a radiant smile illuminating her face. In her arms, wrapped in the community quilt, lay a tiny bundle. "You have a son," she said softly as Preston approached the bed with reverent steps. "A strong, perfect son." Dr. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations. Both mother and child are doing well despite the early arrival. He's small but healthy, good lungs on that boy." As if to prove the point, the baby let out another cry, his tiny face scrunching in displeasure. "Would you like to hold him?" Willa asked, carefully transferring the swaddled infant to Preston's arms. The moment was transformative. Looking down at his son's face, the miniature features, the wisps of dark hair, the tiny hands curled into fists, Preston felt a love so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. "Hello, Thomas George Miller," he whispered, using the name they had chosen if the baby was a boy, honoring both Preston's father and Willa's. "Welcome to the world." As dawn broke over the Miller ranch, bathing the land in golden light, Preston sat beside his wife on their bed, their son nestled between them. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and new, much like the fresh beginning they now embraced as a family. "I never thought I could be this happy," Willa murmured, leaning her head against Preston's shoulder. "That day in the forest when I thought I might die alone under that tree, I couldn't have imagined this." Preston pressed a kiss to her temple. "I think part of me knew even then. When I saw you there, so brave despite your fear, something inside me recognized what I'd been searching for without knowing it." "My hero," she said with a soft smile, watching as their son's eyes, blue like his father's, opened briefly before closing again in sleep. "No," Preston corrected gently. "We're heroes together. Building this life, creating this family, it takes both of us, lifting what needs to be lifted, supporting each other through whatever comes." As young Thomas slept peacefully between them, Preston and Willa sat in contented silence, watching the sunlight slowly fill their room. Outside, the ranch was coming to life, horses nickering in the pasture, chickens clucking in the yard, the sound of the stream flowing clear and strong across their land. This was home. This was love. This was the beginning of all they would build together in the years to come. 5 years later, the Miller Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous horse breeding operations in the territory. Preston's careful selective breeding had produced lines known for both strength and temperament, sought after by buyers from across the country. Willa's writing career had flourished as well. Her novel, Beneath the Pine, based on their meeting, had been published to critical acclaim and healthy sales. She had followed it with a collection of frontier stories that captured the spirit of the West with authenticity and heart. Thomas, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit, had been joined by a 3-year-old sister, Emma Rose, whose auburn curls and mischievous smile had the entire household wrapped around her tiny finger. On a warm June afternoon, as Willa sat on the porch watching Preston teaching Thomas to ride his first pony, Emma nestled in her lap with a picture book. She reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The fallen tree that had nearly taken her life had instead given her everything she'd ever wanted: a loving husband, beautiful children, a home filled with joy, and work that fulfilled her creative spirit. Preston looked up from the corral, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still capable of making her heart skip a beat after all these years, held the same warmth and tenderness it had the day he'd proposed. "Mama, look," Thomas called, sitting proudly atop the gentle pony as Preston led it in a slow circle. "I'm riding by myself. I see you, sweetheart." Willa called back, her heart swelling with pride. Emma wiggled off her lap, pointing excitedly. Me next," Preston laughed, lifting Thomas down and setting him on the fence rail. "Your turn will come, princess, when you're a little bigger." Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Preston and Willa stood on the porch, his arm around her waist as they watched the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the fields. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, a question he posed from time to time, always with the same underlying wonder that this life was truly theirs. Willa turned in his embrace, looking up at the face that had become as familiar and necessary to her as her own reflection. The years had added a few lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but to her he was more handsome than ever. "Not one," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Except perhaps that we waited so long to meet. Think of all the years we could have had together." Preston's arms tightened around her. "We have now, we have the future, and I intend to make the most of every moment." As stars began to appear in the deepening twilight, Preston and Willa Miller walked hand in hand back into the home they had built together, a home founded on courage, sustained by love, and filled with the kind of happiness that comes not from perfect circumstances, but from two hearts determined to face whatever life brings, side by side. It had begun with a fallen tree and an act of extraordinary strength. It would continue with the everyday miracles of a life well lived together.